This is the closing plenary on plant retirement planning. We've got Paul Sotkiewicz, who used to be the chief economist at PJM here, who's going to be chairing and opening the session. I think it's a really hot topic around the industry today. Everybody's talking about it. Everybody's concerned about it, and I don't think we have all the answers, but hopefully we'll have a good discussion and get some ideas for pointing things in the right direction. So let me go ahead and turn it over to Paul. Lavalier, okay.
Wow, let's see. Closing plenary session or sunshine? I see what's winning. I was going to say, where's Mark O'Malley to whistle everybody in and gather everybody here? Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank Charlie for the invitation to come and chair this panel, and for all the panelists for their time that they are going to put into this. I think we're going to have a really good session. But what I want to do is to kind of set the stage, if you will, is just kind of give you some ideas, a bunch of, dare I say, bullet points of things that I think we have to worry about. I think we all understand and know what the energy transition is happening. We've got a lot of environmental policy, and it's not just decarbonization. It's EPA policy on criteria pollutants. It's water discharge policy from fossil plants. We've got policies in Illinois that are flat just shutting units down. There's no opportunity to operate beyond a date certain. And we also have potentially explosive load growth, whether we have data centers or onshoring of manufacturing. Keep in mind that we're in 2024, and load growth, peak load growth, or even total energy has, for all intents and purposes, since 2007, the start of the Great Recession, been flat. So now there's a bit of panic. And so that kind of sets the stage. And of course, we have this energy transition going on. We got to worry about reliability, and we also have to worry about affordability, which is why we have David Lapp here to talk from the Maryland People's Council's perspective. For those of you who are not familiar with the Maryland People's Council, is the consumer advocate for the folks in the state of Maryland. So if we think about that, we can also think about what has been the bridge fuel in natural gas. And I'm not going to dive too much into this before these opening remarks, but there's this whole issue of gas-electric coordination. The gas markets do not play nicely with the electric markets. System operations and RTOs don't understand how gas pipeline systems work. Gas pipeline systems don't understand how power systems work. This has been going on for now 25 years, and we're not much closer to where we've been. We've got a mismatch also in the commodity trading with the timing of wholesale power markets as well as operations. We have a mismatch between operator decisions and the timing of nomination and flows on gas pipelines is a big subtext here. We have a mismatch between the gas day and the electric day. For those of you who don't know, the gas day is the same across the entire set of North America. It's 9 a.m. Central to 9 a.m. Central. Everybody's electric day is on the clock day. So if you're in the Eastern time zone, you're 1 hour ahead of the gas day. It's 10 a.m. to 10 a.m. Central time zone, it's the same. If you're in California, it's 7 a.m. to 7 a.m. So it's a little bit different. We have an unwillingness of a lot of gas generators to actually buy firm transportation service, whether it's just garden variety firm or no notice service. Costs are also hard to recover in RTO markets. That would help. Pipelines are becoming more restrictive on their service. There have been incidences of late where we've seen gas-fired generators with firm service actually turned off by gas pipelines, exacerbating reliability problems. So we have a lot to actually conquer there, but that's not going to be the big thing here. What's really the big thing going forward here is what we're going to talk about with the retirements. And so what I want to do is think about state and federal regulators. And this is, if I think about regulation, most of you probably don't have to deal with this. But traditional utility regulation coming out of the early 1900s was about trying not necessarily to create a competitive force where there was a natural monopoly, but it was in fact asked for by the utilities who wanted to protect their profits because there actually was competition, they were losing money. there's traditional regulatory capture. Regulators have tended to be risk averse, and I hope Matt will push back on me. Matt Schuerger here is formerly from the Minnesota Commission, and tend to be risk averse because if mistakes get made and we see cost disallowances. Anybody ever heard of the Vogtle nuclear plants in Georgia? Summer that didn't get built, Kemper IGCC, for which the costs were disallowed by the Mississippi Commission, Edwardsport IGCC in Indiana. These were all risky bets and they didn't pay off. And there were a lot of cost disallowances. We know that the incentives under regulation are to actually build capital intensive projects and to do the known and true thing as opposed to be innovative. And so Matt Schuerger, again, who is a senior fellow here, or fellow with ESIG, and formerly with the Minnesota Commission, is going to actually lead off the discussion. And so hopefully Matt will give us some insights on that. We also know that retirements are going to happen. I mean, let's think about this. I'm an economist, by the way. This may be the only panel where we've got economists, a lawyer, and engineers for the entire conference. But retirements are going to happen, whether it's age, whether it's environmental policy, but ultimately it's going to be about the economics. Is it profitable? Is it worthwhile to keep you around? We're going to see old facilities go away. We want them to go away. If they're old and inefficient, they should go away and make way for the new facilities that are more efficient, more innovative. We've seen cost reductions in combined cycle gas, wind, solar resources. They're natural replacements from an economic perspective, maybe not necessarily liability perspective. But from an economist perspective, this is sort of the creative destruction argument that Joseph Schumpeter has talked about, for those of you who are familiar with Schumpeter. And then, of course, we have the demand growth that I've talked about, and so on. And so now we're actually worried about reliability issues. And so Mark Olson from NERC is actually going to be the second speaker on the panel, is going to actually address a lot of those issues from NERC's perspective. Now, the next thing is to think about when we do see retirements, what happens? Most generator retirements go quietly into the night. You don't hear about them. They just disappear. You might see a smokestack get blown up on TV and see that's pretty cool to see it imploded. Except in certain circumstances. Many of you have probably heard about what happened to the Key Bridge in Baltimore, right? Sorry, Ben. I was in DC when it happened, brother. The Brandon Shores and H.A. Wagner plants are just on the other side, outside the harbor from where the Key Bridge is. So I'm giving you a sense of the location. I'm not trying to say the Key Bridge is a reliability problem, Ben. But when we had a retirement, all of a sudden when you do the study and say, oh my God, we cannot let a unit go away for reliability reasons, I look at that as a market failure. That means there is something wrong with the markets, the RTO markets, that are not valuing the reliability attribute. Whether it's from a resource adequacy perspective, or in the case of the Wagner and Brandon Shores units, from a transmission perspective. They were effectively providing transmission service into the Baltimore, Washington area. Now you're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars in transmission upgrade costs. And that doesn't include the cost of keeping the units open for more years. And so it's also, I would argue, a market failure. And I know we've got folks here from the Alberta system, or Alberta Market Surveillance Administrator. And I know I'm not poking fun at Alberta. I'm just saying we have market monitors in the room, but it's also a market monitoring failure when this. So ultimately, I don't know why this is cutting out. Ultimately, market monitors have been responsible for mitigating offers into the energy and capacity markets. That mitigation has not been compensatory. It has not recognized a lot of these reliability attributes and these costs that should have been allowed in the offers to keep these resources in service, to not find ourselves in the situation that David Lapp from the Maryland OPC is going to talk about. And I think you're going to find his numbers extremely eye-opening in that sense. And just one of many times we may see this. This is going to be the Brandon Shores plant is going to be the poster child for future retirements. But then if we think about going forward here in the power industry. So if we think about the supply side, most of us are engineers here in the room. This industry was founded and built upon the idea that we cannot control demand. Demand cannot control itself. that everything is a supply side problem. It's a simple engineering problem. We've been indoctrinated with that idea. Listen to the language that we often use. It's always supply side language. I was just in Washington yesterday at a conference for the Electric Power Supply Association, and Jim Robb was the keynote speaker in the morning, Mark's boss. And everything that Jim said talking about reliability was from the perspective of everything is supply side, nothing about controlling the demand side. And so we're going to see sort of a transition to that. Paul Denholm's going to talk about storage toward the end of the session. And then Debbie Liu is going to talk about controllable demand in that sense. And thinking about, we can use the demand side to help meet those reliability goals as well as the affordability goals. Now, in thinking about all these things, getting a little bit more precise, and I think no one here would disagree with this, no matter whether we have wind or solar on the system or IBRs and talking about oscillations, the principles of system operation remain. We still have to maintain supply-demand balance. We still have to hold contingency to observe the transmission limits, voltage limits, thermal limits, transient stability. Those don't change. Now, a lot of policymakers want to make that go away and pretend it doesn't exist, but it exists. And I think one of the things that Paul was going to discuss in his presentation is that we need to think long and hard about that if with these fantasy ideas that we can move to 100% renewables and we're not going to have necessarily any problems here. And then finally, getting to where Debbie's going to be at. As an economist, we like to think of prices as the ultimate control signal. Now, this is very unlike engineers. My experience in working with engineers down on the floor, I was the chief economist at PJM for 8 years. Seeing how the thinking that goes into this. Engineering solutions is like we've come up with a solution and all we have to say is you have to do this and make it so, as if it were command and control. Yes, I'm pointing the fingers at all the engineers in the room. The world doesn't work that way. People respond to prices. We all do. We go, if there's something that's too expensive, what do? We choose to buy less of it or not to buy it at all. If something is cheaper, we might buy more of it. We do this unconsciously every day in our lives. Electric power should be no different. And so if we think about that and having the demand side really built in to respond to that, the demand, if we actually think about sending demand price signals that allows them to respond to the reliability needs of the system, we can go a long way toward meeting the reliability requirements and the affordability requirements. Forget about the headline price per megawatt hour. It's about what the final bill looks like. Let's not get caught up in the headline price. Let's get caught up in expenditures. How much are we actually spending in total? And so with that, Debbie is going to provide, I think, sort of like as batting cleanup here. The punchline here is that we're already there. We already have demand side options and they work very well. And so with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Matt. And again, thank you for coming in. I know it's the last session. It's been a long 2 days. The weather's nice and it's been crappy the previous 2 days. But thank you for being here. Matt, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Paul. Really appreciate it. As Paul mentioned, I'm recently started as a senior fellow with ESIG, which I'm thrilled about. Just a couple of weeks ago, started that. But this afternoon on this panel, I'm really speaking from my Minnesota experience. The last 8 years as a commissioner at the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission, just wrapped that up in December, where I was immersed in challenges of reliable, affordable utility service that's increasingly clean and resilient. While I was a commissioner, I got to engage with Organization of MISO States and MISO in regional reliability issues. Also got to NERC and in national issues, as well as NERC on the member representative committee representing regulatory bodies. So that's been the last 8 years of my life. But my perspective is also informed by the 15 years prior to that, working as a power system engineer on grid reliability studies. All of this kind of comes together to form my perspective on retirements here. So just to start with a little bit of framing, Minnesota, the grids in Minnesota and the upper Midwest, like much of the country, are really undergoing transformational change, decarbonization, decentralization, digitization. We're not only continuing this transformation going forward, but it's really accelerating due to recent state policy as well as federal policy. In Minnesota, we're a vertically integrated retail rate regulated state that operates within the footprint of MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. And in Minnesota, we've had for a long time a really robust integrated resource planning process. We recently, 5 years or so ago, implemented integrated distribution planning. And we've been fortunate to have in the Midwest through MISO regionally what I would say is a recently reinvigorated regional transmission planning process, really starting 5 or 6 years ago, picking up what had been a multi-year gap with the long-range transmission planning. Over the last 25 years, the portion of electric energy in Minnesota consumption that was generated from coal dropped from about 2/3 to roughly 1/4. And over that same period, the amount of energy generated from renewables, largely wind and solar, increased from essentially none to about 1/3 currently. We have in Minnesota for several decades demonstrated really strong success in energy efficiency, and we recognize the critical importance of flexible, responsive load, but I'd say we really lag behind in that area. We have a fair amount of legacy emergency load shed demand response, but really have lacked in the type of forward-looking, flexible, responsive load implementation that's available with current technologies. Integrated resource decisions to date, we've set firm retirement dates for our full coal fleet in Minnesota. That's going to happen over the next 10 years or so. And we've established that the portion of electricity from renewables is going to grow to at least 50% by 2030. We've got 2 nuclear plants that are running well. And they've been approved to seek second license extensions. So we foresee continuing with the nuclear fleet. And we have a natural gas fleet that will continue to be available as a resource as needed. There hasn't really been interest in retiring the natural gas fleet, but we really see that fleet operating less and less going forward. And the Minnesota legislature has really set really clear targets to decarbonize the electric grid and to do so by 2040. So full decarbonization of the electric grid. And at the same time, we're working and taking steps to electrify the economy, starting with transportation and with buildings. So from that context, I want to touch initially on a couple of key issues and points related to plant retirement planning. So coal plant retirements in Minnesota, the retirements in Minnesota of coal plants are being done with forward-looking planning. When we're setting these firm closure dates, we're doing so with long lead times, on the order of 8 to 12 years ahead of time. And we're doing so that we make sure that we have time to plan for replacement resources, but also importantly, that we have time to transition both workers and host communities, which are a big part of these retirements. As we look at our carbon goals and our requirements that are set by our legislature, I think a lot of folks have raised the question of putting some type of hard restrictions on natural gas plants. In my experience as a regulator, that's very difficult to do. And in my view, frankly, not actually a good idea to do, to put hard restrictions on. I think there's a variety of issues related to it, but among those is that putting regulatory limits on annual run hours can jeopardize regional accreditation, which is important for the role of those resources. Alternatively, I think approach that can work well depending on the jurisdictional environment is to pay a lot of attention to the modeling results, showing that a limited set of hours are needed from those natural gas fleet units. And then to get explicit agreements from utilities on run hours and require annual reporting and verification of actual run hours. And for us in a vertically integrated environment like Minnesota, that approach can be workable. The retirements in Minnesota are really in the context of ongoing rigorous reliability analysis. It's been critically important. There's been a set of integration studies that we've done in Minnesota early and often through this last couple of decades of transition. We started, I think the first one was in 2001. I think it was actually a UBIG study that we spent a considerable amount of time studying 5% wind on the system to see the impacts of that in 2001. In 2006, we looked at 25%. And in 2013, we looked at 40 and 50%. These studies were deep analysis that included power flow, production simulation, transient stability, system strength. And importantly, they were inclusive study teams and technical review and resulted in broadly supported outcomes and results. And I really think this has been important in Minnesota, and our pathway to retiring these large plants is getting a broad understanding deep in the utilities, operations, and transmission planners, but in stakeholders as well as policymakers of what the reliability environment is around retirement. When we look at reliability analysis from a commission perspective, we recognize that traditional approaches which cover adequacy and stability are still necessary, but are clearly no longer sufficient. That in addition to traditional resource adequacy, we need to increasingly look at energy sufficiency around energy constrained resources. Wind and solar certainly, but also, frankly, gas plants, as I think Paul just teed up, are an energy constrained resource, and we need to make sure we're accounting for those risks as well as trying to figure out ways to incorporate accounting for essential reliability services, voltage support, frequency response, ramping, and flexibility. How do we pull that into an account for that in the planning process? And increasingly, resilience is really important with the increased frequency of extreme weather events as well as cyber. So for us in Minnesota, the most important success factor is active forward-looking system planning, integrated resource planning, integrated distribution plannings, regional transmission planning, as well as reliability assessment. So I want to hit a couple of summary points to wrap up. The transformation has to be done reliably and affordably, but it also has to be done resiliently and equitably. We need to continue to modernize our grids, particularly the distribution systems. We recognize that we can't afford to just build our way out of this on the supply side, these challenges. We've got to get into the distribution systems and distributed resources. We also need to modernize our regulatory approach, improved use of tools such as rate design and performance metrics. And we're evolving to an increasingly integrated grid where we see significant resources coming from all areas of the grid. So as our energy systems continue to evolve, decarbonizing the grid and electrifying the economy, we see the future from where we've approached it in Minnesota as really being grounded in fundamentals of reliability and resilience, affordability and equity, and importantly, centered around choices that our customers are making and things that they're asking for. So I'll stop there. I look forward to the discussion. Look forward to the rest of the presentations.
Matt, thank you very much for that perspective on this. And so next we're going to go from a regulatory perspective to NERC. And sorry what I said about Jim earlier, Mark, about the supply side stuff, but I think Mark's going to have some slides and some insights here from the long-term resource assessment plan that should concern us all. And I think, we heard some of that from Matt, but I think it's more than just Minnesota. I think we're seeing this nationwide.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paul. I left my clicker right there. Very good. Thank you. Well, good afternoon. My name's Mark Olson. I'm with the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. On the agenda, I think it says that the topic is reliability standards. So the plenary is plant retirement planning, and my portion is reliability standards. So let me think. If I could write a reliability standard that said, "Thou shalt not retire a power plant before all the reliability solutions are in place and the detailed planning has been accomplished like they've done in Minnesota," that would be wonderful. But the reality is we can't. NERC's jurisdiction does not include infrastructure development and resource decisions. That is left to the states. So what do we do? Well, we have reliability assessments. That's what is within NERC's jurisdiction to perform. I'm going to talk to you today about our long-term reliability assessment that we published in December. We write these for a broad stakeholder audience because of that reason. We need to get the word to policymakers of how we see the risks in the future timeframes for resource adequacy and also to provide them with insights on trends in resources and transmission so that they can help make informed decisions. I think the technical content that of this week here in ESIG is quite something to see. It's really amazing. Our reliability assessments are a little bit more simple. We include. I'll go through and talk about some of the different analysis techniques that we use, but a lot of the real challenges with planning the system to be adequate and to be able to serve demand 24/7, 7 days a week under normal and more extreme conditions are really technical, deeply technical and challenging issues to be addressed. And that's where great work from ESIG and all of you is just the huge role that's the huge role that you play. Our long-term reliability assessment, again, is one of the functions that we perform as a international regulatory organization with authority in the US and Canada. In terms of assessing the reliability, we perform the LTRA and release it every December. We also perform summer and winter reliability assessments. Again, written for a broad stakeholder audience. And I think some of the real value that we provide to the regulators and policymakers is a couple of things. One, we rely on the demand and generation and demand response forecasts that come from the industry planners. There's minimal assumptions. We don't add to the load forecasting with assumptions and projections and scenarios to a great extent. Secondly, there's a broad coordination and review by experts across the industry to produce this assessment report. So we have essentially a peer review mechanism that is involved here. And then third, we assess a wide range of risks, not just the normal expected peak demand and normal resource performance, but we also look for more extreme but plausible scenarios like 90/10 load forecasts and high outage rate scenarios like we've seen in winter storms and heat wave events. Just a real quick high-level overview of specific highlights for the resource adequacy portion of the long-term reliability assessment, and this is really a large part of what is in the LTRA. And what we see really is that the reliability challenges over the next 10 years they are mounting. I think what the significant change from this year to last is the increase in peak demand projections across the entire North American bulk power system. On the left here is a peak demand growth projection chart showing both the peak summer demand and peak winter demand growth over 10-year horizons. All the way at the left is the 2015 long-term reliability assessment, that growth showing there, and all the way at the right is our latest projection. You can see from the last three long-term reliability assessments, the last three sets of bars there, that growth, that peak demand growth rapidly growing. We also have energy projections in our report, and it's a similar story. Energy is really rising even steeper, the annual energy projections over the 10-year horizon. Interestingly, the summer growth is being outpaced by the winter growth. The winter is slightly higher, the peak demands in winter. What's inside that is those load forecasts are starting to show more of the electrification impacts are being factored in from heating systems, industrial load, and electric vehicle growth, and it's affecting the winter a little bit faster than the summer. Next to that over is the generator retirements, and I'm going to talk more about generator retirements projections in a future slide here, but we see basically the loss of thermal resources over the 10-year horizon. It's really more like over the next 5 years. And then at the bottom here is showing how really over 3 time periods, looking back 10 years to current to the future 10 years, how our on-peak capacity is changing in the system, and really kind of static. There's not a lot of change. Now, what's going into that projection is in that future 10-year projection is our anticipated resources that are most firm. So it's the tier 1 resources that are most further along in the development queue. So there's plenty more resources that are still coming through, more resources to be added to help meet the demand, but they're going to be primarily wind, solar, and battery in terms of just supply side resources. So changing resource mix, and it's happening very quickly, and that can cause energy risks. That is when the dispatchable capability of the resources in the mix aren't sufficient to be able to meet changing demand profiles. The right side is the overall risk map that comes out of our capacity and energy risk assessment. This is based on looking at peak reserve margins, so very simple reserve margin versus a reference margin level kind of analysis, but also all hours probabilistic assessments are conducted, particularly for areas where the resource mix and the demand is highly variable. And then also we'll consider scenarios like 90-10 demand or low resource output conditions. Our high-risk areas shown there in the middle of the country there, it's MISO and CERC Central, and largely the conditions there are in MISO. Generator retirements have happened faster than can keep up with the reliability criteria. Really starting in the years 2027 and later. And then in CERC Central, there are plans to decommission coal-fired plants and replace them with natural gas. But they're not quite lined up right with demand projections to meet the load forecasts. I'm going to keep moving here and talk more about the generator retirements that we looked at. We essentially have accounted for over 80 gigawatts of generator retirements in making that assessment on the previous slide. Those are all represented here on the blue bars of these charts. Anticipated retirements are retirements that the ISO RTOs or the regional planners are currently factoring into their plans. So they're usually in a retirement planning process. And with those retirements, we see the risks that we saw on the prior map. There are likely to be it's possible that there could be significantly more generator retirements in the future. The additional 31 gigawatts of generators have announced plans to retire, but they haven't entered into the retirement planning process yet. Those are represented by the orange bars there. And across the bottom are our assessment areas, and the little circles along those show you where they currently are in our risk assessments, where we just consider the anticipated retirements. So the takeaway, Additional retirements can exacerbate the risks to energy and capacity that we looked at. But I think more importantly, the implications of retirements can affect resource adequacy. You know, as new resources need to be added to the queue, there's certainly more resources are out there. But as they come in, can they come in on time? Can we get them there in time to meet an accelerating demand profile? The tremendous amount of system planning considerations that go into this kind of changing resource mix. And then gas and electric interdependence. As these coal-fired plants retire, we have more reliance on our natural gas fleet to be able to be that dispatchable resource that can counter extreme weather events or low variable energy resource times. And so reliability out of the gas fleet and a reliable fuel supply is really important. There's so much more I could say about that, but in the interest of time, we're going to have to keep moving. There are basically 4 broad categories of recommendations in our LTRA, and there are, generally written for stakeholders that include policymakers and regulators. But I would just say, when it comes to the resource mix, and item number 1 here, there are a number of reliability standards projects. I needed to get the reliability standards. There are a number of reliability standards projects underway that should make our existing resources more reliable. These include new cold weather standards, standards to improve the performance of inverter-based resources, and standards for providing for energy assurance in planning. So it's important that our resources be reliable and that we continue to grow our resource mix to meet the rising demand and do it in a reliable fashion. I look forward to the questions when we get into the panel session, and I'll maybe we'll touch on some more of these recommendations. But there's a lot out there, and I would just say that the important work of folks here at involved with ESIG is really going to determine the success of this transition and meeting the rising energy, the rising demand and energy profile. So I salute you all for what you're doing here, and it's exciting to hear about the topics that you're working on.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you very much. Give Mark a hand here for getting up here and actually delivering what looks like bad news. When I think about some of this stuff and I see a lot of the NERC studies, I feel like, I'm in the bathtub. There's an electric appliance close by, isn't there? Do I have to face this going forward? At least it'll solve part of the load problem. Next is David. David Lapp is going to talk about the retirements and implications of those retirements. I think Matt talked about this a little bit with resilience and equity, especially with affected communities. I think this is sort of the equity issue and affected communities on steroids that David's going to talk about. So, David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And first, I wanted to say thank you for ESIG for having me here today as a lawyer and also as a consumer advocate. We heard this morning, I was listening to the session, and we had Excel talk about writing a really big check, and the Excel is writing the check. It's important to keep in mind that that check, it comes from the customer's balance. The customers are paying for that check. And so what we're talking about here, I think a lot in this conference is matters really important to consumers. And Mark just discussed retirements occurring before new generation is online. And that's what we're talking about here with RMRs, or reliability must-run contracts. And I think Paul referenced Brandon Shores as being the poster child for future retirements. And really, we think that is the case, or could be the case, for Brandon Shores, sort of the canary in the coal mine. And at my final couple slides are going to actually show some of the significant costs related to that. But I wanted to talk about first about what is creating the scenario that causes these RMRs to happen, and how Maryland, more broadly speaking, more than just Brandon Shores and Wagner, which is next to it, also an RMR facility, how those are just part of what's going on in Maryland generally. And that is because Maryland, there's 3 locational deliverability areas that encompass all of Maryland. Those are LDAs, they're designated by PJM, and those are locally constrained areas. So where there's a limited amount of transmission coming in, and so we depend heavily on the generation within those areas. And this first slide here shows these areas within PJM. And so you can see in the green areas, and then next to it, DPLS, the purple area, those areas encompass all of Maryland. So Maryland is particularly vulnerable to these locational deliverability areas, and essentially they're load pockets. So we rely heavily on the generation within those areas and also the transmission coming into those areas. And so when a generation plant announces its retirement, it sends off, it starts a race to figure out how we're going to figure out how to resolve that problem. And so it's a combination of how soon can we get maybe generation in that area to make up for the departing generation. But more commonly, what we're relying on are huge transmission projects to be able to import power into the area, and those take time. And what the RMRs do after a generator, in the case of Brandon Shores, it's owned by Talon. They announced their intent to deactivate, to retire that plant, and PJM does an analysis and says, do we need this plant for reliability purposes? And if they determine that it is needed for reliability purposes, then it's going to look to an RMR as a solution. And that RMR unit is going to get paid an out-of-market price to remain open. And it's a voluntary action at PJM. I think in some other RTO areas, it may not be voluntary, but in PJM, it's voluntary. So PJM essentially asks the generator, will you be willing to stay open until the transmission fix is available? And then that generator will essentially try and be treated as something akin to cost of service recovery out of market, which tends to be very expensive, as we'll see shortly. So this next slide shows the 3 Maryland local deliverability areas. And I want to give credit to my colleague Phil Sussler, who did the work to put together these graphs. And on the left, you see what the PJM reliability requirement is for that LDA. And these requirements are in a state of flux. PJM just went through a new accreditation process, and it's going to, I think in April, come up with new reliability criteria, but we don't think it's going to change this overall picture. So we see in that orange bar where the reliability requirement is, and then in the light blue bar next to it is the current generation and imports without the retirements. So that includes right now Brandon Shores, Wagner, those plants are operating, so it includes those. The blue bar next to it shows the generation post-retirement in imports. And so that includes all the import capacity that can be brought in and the in-area generation. And you can see that it drops below the reliability requirement. And that is reflected in the gray bar for BGE and DPL South. It's actually negative. The next bar shows, and it's sort of grayed out because it's very tentative. And that's what's in the interconnection queue. And I think a lot of folks in this room are probably very aware that just because it's in the interconnection queue does not mean it's going to be there when time comes. PJM has suspended its interconnection queue and it's sort of changing its processes. So there's not a lot of movement there right now. And there's just general attrition out of the interconnection queue. There's processing administration problems, which is reflected in PJM's current suspension. And also a good part of this interconnection queue is renewable energy, which doesn't perform the same as the coal generation that is being retired. And so those issues have to be dealt with. Of course, these charts focus on resource adequacy, and there are other elements that need to be accounted for. So I see time is moving, so I do want to move on. Okay, thank you. So I want to move on to talk about the actual costs. And for the RMRs, for these units that are needed to be kept running, there are two sets of costs. One is the RMR itself. And we've run some numbers, and these are very tentative, and each situation is very unique. So these aren't projections of actual costs, but they're the best estimates we have on the data that's available. And we have 17 RMRs that in PJM since 2017. The average cost of those has been about 16 times what comes out of the capacity market. And so based on some of those numbers, we see here the RMR cost, annual costs of $296 million, over $1 billion. And these are just for Baltimore Gas and Electric. Brandon Shores and Wagner is within BGE's territory. There are some other costs, but the bulk of them is within BGE's LDA and BGE customers, therefore. The average residential bill impact, $9, over $100 a year. Then aside from the RMR costs themselves, we have assessed the impact on the capacity market. And, you know, because RMRs historically under PJM, they do not participate in the capacity market. So that predictably is going to increase the cost. Now, again, it could turn out that they do participate, unlike any other RMR in the past, or one of them could and one of them couldn't. But essentially, as long as one of them does not participate in PJM, it'll hit the price ceiling, and there'll be a major additional price impact for customers. And, you know, if they both don't participate, it would be $5 a month. And actually, if one of them participates, it would actually be more, because that unit would get capacity payments, but the price ceiling would still be hit. So it's kind of ironic that if one of Brandon Shores or Wagner's would participate, the costs actually go up. And finally, we have the cost of the transmission expenditures themselves. And so for BGE customers, of the $726 million that PJM projects for those costs, it's the allocation to BGE customers is $534 million, annual costs of $73 million, lesser bill impact, still significant for customers. And this isn't the only RMR. We're litigating Indian River 4, another coal plant that has retired, and we're litigating over the RMR costs there. And I'll wrap it up just by saying I think we need more proactive planning on the part of PJM to prevent these high costs for customers, and also to allow for competitive procurement of transmission, because when these things need to happen really fast, PJM rules are allowing it to avoid a competitive procurement for the transmission investments themselves. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to be here.
David, thank you very much. By the way, think about these costs in perspective. This is just for one set of retirements and the bill impact here. Okay, so David's use of the canary in the coal mine is right, but I think we're starting to see a running theme here. And I think one of the things that, you know, we heard from Matt is talking about the gas resources. We don't want to run limit those resources, but let's not also get too dependent upon them. Mark's talking about replacement resources that are dispatchable. Tell me what's dispatchable that you're going to build that is not gas and get an air permit for it. Anybody? No, nothing. You're not going to get an air permit for it. And chances are the air permit is going to one time restrict you in some way, shape, or form, depending upon your location and whether you're actually in an ambient, if you're violating NERC standards. And so now you're seeing the repercussions of this, and you probably will ask the question, I'm teeing this up, maybe David for you, is what kind of replacement resource do you think could go in there, if anything? And so thinking about that, can gas always be the answer? Or can you find a different answer? Paul's going to actually talk about one of those answers right now. So Paul, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. So the question of my presentation here is, can storage provide firm capacity and actually replace retiring generators? And you can probably imagine where I'm going with this. And I think the answer to that is yes. But we need to talk about a couple of different things beyond just kind of the ELCC of storage. But I think there's some kind of philosophical issues that you may encounter in talking about this topic. And one of them is when you're looking at something like a coal plant, can storage replace a coal plant? And so obviously, can one storage plant replace all the services provided by one coal plant? And I think the answer to that is, well, obviously not. Storage doesn't provide any energy, so it cannot by itself replace all the services provided by a coal plant. And I think part of this issue is when I started at NREL 20 years ago, we had this kind of active engagement against the word intermittent. And I would offer and suggest that we have an active engagement around the word baseload, because I don't think baseload as an engineering concept is particularly useful energy anymore. So what we have to do is we have to provide resource adequacy and reliability. So if we're talking about resource adequacy in summer peaking systems, I think there's very clear evidence from multiple studies, from multiple consultants and multiple entities. Some of the folks in this room, E3 and Astrape and others have done a lot of this analysis and demonstrating that in summer peaking systems, relatively small amount of storage in terms of duration, say 4 hours, it has high capacity credit. It has high ELCC. So if we're talking about reliability from the purposes of keeping the lights on when it's on hot summer afternoons, relatively short duration storage can do that. So that's a good thing. And I would say from that standpoint, storage can provide firm capacity and replace traditional capacity. Now, just as one quick aside, if you're a modeler or planner, please do not restrict storage to be charging only from renewable resources. You are going to seriously degrade the ability of storage to provide resource adequacy. It's not required from a policy standpoint. Even if you're looking at the pre-IRA ITC requirements for coupled solar and storage, you didn't have to do 100% of your charging from solar. So please, if you're looking at storage as a resource adequacy asset, let it charge from whatever resources to keep the lights on. That's really important. So the first thing I'm saying then is, yes, we have good news that there's clear analytical evidence that storage can provide firm capacity. And it does get better because we also see, again, demonstrated by multiple analytic studies as well as actual empirical evidence that when you start adding solar to the system, and this does not have to be solar coupled with storage, but if you just start adding solar to the system, you get a change in your net load shape that results in shorter duration storage, increasing its effectiveness, and increasing the amount of the peak demand that could be met by some combination of solar and storage. And again, they do not have to be coupled. So these are the kind of the two big important things that are leading towards storage being such a big part of providing additional capacity to the system during the times of retiring units. So that's the good news. The bad news is, I think, pretty clear evidence that there are significant limits to the contribution of relatively short duration storage, say something like less than 10 hours, because of the shift to net winter peaks. So the shift to net winter peaks is a combination of a few systems in the US that are already winter peaking, increased electrification that can result in higher winter peaks, as well as the impact of solar and solar plus storage suppressing summer peaks and shifting the periods of highest loss of load probabilities and loss of load expectations to the winter. In ERCOT in 2022, it was a net winter peaking system because when you add in the contribution of solar to the actual peaks, the net peak. So once you can subtract out the contribution of solar, the residual net demand profile, the loss of load probability is the highest during the winter. Winter peaks are longer than summer peaks. And so when you look at something like the curve on the upper right from Astrape, and you look at the marginal capacity credit of adding storage, it goes on forever in the summer. You know, you're going to be able to do a lot. You add tens of gigawatts of storage, and it will still provide firm capacity in the summer. The problem is all your risk hours have now been shifted to the winter, and the marginal capacity credit of storage starts to drop pretty rapidly. So now we need to do something like go to longer duration storage. And unfortunately, we're not there yet with lithium ion technology. So all of this wonderful news that you're hearing about storage being cost competitive, and I think I can pencil out storage beating out a new aeroderivative gas turbine in much of the US on a life cycle cost basis. That's all based on 4 to 6 hour lithium ion batteries. It's not based on 8 or 10 hour lithium ion batteries. There, the combustion turbine is going to be cheaper. So until we get these longer duration storage technologies, we are kind of getting to the point where that wonderful news of storage being cost competitive starts to fall apart a little bit. And so this is the challenge of assuming that storage will be able to kind of maintain its high capacity credit forever. And as we push farther and farther into deeply decarbonized systems and look at 95 or 100% systems, then we really run into the seasonal mismatch problem. And so when you look at the various 100% renewables or really 95% plus renewable energy studies that have been done, I think there's this consistent theme of this kind of poorly termed idea of clean firm capacity. I wish we could get away from that terminology because, again, there's no such thing as firm capacity, but until somebody comes up with a better terminology, we're stuck with it. But we do need some kind of capacity that can deal with multi-day events. Now, personally, I believe that these multi-day events are not as common as we fear, but they're still common enough to be 1 in 10 or whatever standard you're going to use. So even if they're not happening all the time, they're happening long enough that you're going to need something to deal with these multi-day periods of low wind and solar in 100% systems. And so the curve on the right hand, the bottom right is something that NREL did, but again, you can look at multiple studies and look at this. And so I'd like to just kind of point out the fact that the red is the amount of capacity that you're getting from storage, which is very large in these scenarios, hundreds of gigawatts of potential opportunities. But the bottom part is the firm capacity contribution of either natural gas plants or something that is this magical clean firm technology. In this case, we're talking about something like a hydrogen-fueled combustion turbine. And in many cases, there are more hundreds of gigawatts of that technology than there are of the shorter duration technology. And that's kind of the unfortunate news in terms of getting to deeply decarbonized systems. Now, I'd also like to point out that these are really low capacity factor resources. I mean, these really are kind of peaking resources, and I'm okay with continuing to use the word peaking resource because at least I can define that mathematically, and I think it makes sense. So these kind of things don't really bother me from a standpoint of if I've got a 4% capacity factor, I'm not really producing much NOx, but again, philosophically, that's a separate conversation. Again, the point of all this is, I think the idea that we'll never build another peaking resource in the US, I don't see it. Because I don't know how to get to 100% renewable energy system without something that can run for multiple days at a time. In the LA100 study that we did, we looked at, again, trying to get to raw 100% renewable energy, and we ended up replacing existing gas-fired plants on almost a 1-to-1 basis with these hydrogen-fueled combustion turbines, because we did have occasionally 3 days of low wind and sun. We also had transmission outages in constrained urban areas, which of course you could just simply replace by adding multiple new transmission lines into densely populated urban centers. So no problem there. But if you can't do that, then you are stuck with needing something else. And in this case, we are talking about replacing existing gas turbines with something that looks and smells like a gas turbine, just with using a clean renewable fuel. So I think that coming back full circle, I think there's a long ways to go, and there's huge opportunities for relatively short duration energy storage that are deployable and cost competitive right now. So I don't want the end state of this 100% to ignore the fact that there's tons we can do now. And I'm skeptical of people that say that we need to install seasonal storage or extremely long duration storage right now. I don't think we have to, but we do run into the problem of what do we do if we want to get to these incredibly deep levels of decarbonization without something, again, that kind of looks and smells like a natural gas turbine fired with something else. So I'll stop there and happy to talk during the question session. Thank you.
Paul, thank you very much. So far, I think the news only gets even more depressing. Storage is not going to be the solution, is it, to this problem? But you know what we've done? I'll harken back to my opening comments. We're still only talking about supply side solutions, aren't we? Debbie's going to disabuse us of this now, that we have to seriously think about the demand side as an active participant in system operations and in power markets. Because otherwise, I don't think we can get to where policymakers want to go. If we want to get to 100% renewables, we can't do it without the stuff that Debbie's going to talk about now. The floor is yours, Debbie.
Thanks, Paul. And Paul, that was brilliant. Thanks for that. So I'm going to talk about the last solution here, demand flexibility. And I think, we're really focused here on resource adequacy and operational reliability. So let me talk about resource adequacy. And in the back there, I see who I regard as the father of adequacy for modern power systems, Michael Milligan. And when Michael Milligan talks about resource adequacy, he asks the question, why don't we have resource adequacy for coffee beans or for computer chips, right? Or any other commodity? What makes electricity different? There's a lot of things that are different, but the two big differences are we assume that load is not sensitive to price and that utilities have this obligation to serve. And Paul talked a little bit about this, about load being able to do whatever it wants. And we have really elaborate planning functions at the utilities and ISOs to forecast how high load is going to go, to build transmission and distribution infrastructure for that, to build supply side resources to meet that. And because of this, we have to overbuild generation, transmission, and distribution because there's uncertainty, right? In terms of how high that load is going to go. There's a lot of uncertainty. That uncertainty is now exploding for the reasons that Paul said earlier, right? We're electrifying buildings and transportation. We've got data centers and hydrogen, and now we got climate change on top of that. So uncertainty is off the charts. Hopefully everyone was here in the morning session, and so I don't even need to talk about this slide, basically showing that it's a myth that customers don't respond to prices. Customers do respond to prices, and it was a great session this morning talking about the need for enabling technologies, the need for price signals to be high enough so that customers can buy the enabling technologies, or for price signals to be high enough to overcome the opportunity cost for customers who are doing something productive with that electricity. On this graphic, this is ERCOT, and it's showing customers voluntarily reducing their demand to avoid transmission demand charges. So up to 4,500 megawatts in ERCOT last year. This is all voluntary, right? So this is not ERCOT's responsive reserve service, emergency services. This is not dispatched. This is voluntary reductions because they want to avoid a demand charge. Recently, I heard from the Belgian system operator, Elia, that they have 15% of their load now responding to high prices in the day ahead. So not just ERCOT, not just folks responding to transmission charges, customers are now responding to prices. And if we compensated customers for anywhere near the value of lost load during a stress event, I believe we'd get significant load reductions. But a fundamental issue here, and we discussed this, I think it was on the second day, is how much variability in electricity prices we're politically willing to accept. And for the record, I'm not saying everybody needs to go on real-time prices. And it was a great discussion earlier today when Pacific Gas and Electric talked about the same thing that Southern Company does, customers consume off a baseline and are only exposed to prices on the margin. There's a lot of ways to skin this cat of exposing people to prices and ways to do it to help potentially protect customers, but still get load reductions. Peter Markussen from Energinet, from Denmark's Energinet, was going to be here today, and I'm really sad that he's not here. He had a personal conflict, but this is from Energinet's Pathways report, and Energinet in this report proposes full use of their generation, their transmission, and their distribution infrastructure by putting that reserve capacity margin that we hold for that uncertainty, by putting that reserve capacity margin on the demand side of the ledger instead of the supply side, right? So just imagine that, getting full use of all of your infrastructure. On the bottom of this chart here, you can see this is a load duration curve in green of wind and solar output in one of their future scenarios. The wind and solar is in green, and for those same hours, the yellow is showing their flexible demand. So you can see flexible demand makes up a significant amount of that wind and solar production in this particular future scenario. And where are they getting that flexible demand from? They're getting it from power to X, so they're making lots of hydrogen, heat pumps, electric vehicles, batteries. And then you can see there's a tiny sliver of red. Maybe you can't see it because it's so small. It's kind of at the bottom on the right-hand side, and that's the thermal plant production, and that's used when there's very little wind and solar. And this top right graphic is showing operational flexibility. It's a different scenario, unfortunately, but the idea here in this top right graphic is that you've got flexible load on the x-axis, you got wind forecast error on the y-axis, and everything in that green shaded area is where more wind showed up than you thought. And so you can just curtail the wind, or you can ramp up your load to restore balance. And the yellow area, this is where less wind than you expected showed up. And here you can curtail your flexible loads. And then the red area shows, those, not very many hours where the error exceeds how much flexible load you have. And those are the hours where they're going to need some kind of storage, or they're going to need to run thermal generators for those hours. Now, operationally, how are we going to extract this flexibility? In the future, I think we're going to be dispatching more demand. And I apologize if you've seen this before. I just love this chart. This is ERCOT's controllable load resource participation model. And controllable load resources in ERCOT act just like generators act. So it's loads that act just like a generator. They bid in a price curve into the day ahead. They get a schedule. They can participate in the real-time market. They're exposed to real-time prices. They can be dispatched to a set point every 5 minutes. They provide frequency response. They can participate in the ancillary services market. They can set the market price, right? This is really cool. This particular data center shown here, okay, it's a cryptocurrency data center, produces Bitcoins. But the nice thing about this is that they know what their production cost is for these Bitcoins. So their load break-even cost is $125 per megawatt hour. And you can see that when the ERCOT spot price, which is shown in blue, exceeds that $125 red line, that their demand, which is shown in green, will decrease very significantly, right? So this is like 90% drop in demand when the spot price goes above their break-even price. So extremely flexible and responsive. And there's a couple advantages to this kind of market participation model. And by the way, I think all ISOs should do this. I think this is really an amazing model. These loads see the real-time price, so you don't have to meter, you just meter them. You don't have to baseline them. You don't have to worry about monitoring and verification. You just meter them. We know how to meter people. They're dispatched. So the system operator is controlling both sides of the load supply balance. In principle, that could enhance reliability, right? In principle, that could reduce the need for regulation reserve, reduce the need for contingency reserves. It could make reliability better. So, I don't know if I've gone over my time or not, but I would just want to end this by saying the best way to meet demand when supply is short is to have less demand. Thanks.
Thank you, Debbie. And interesting, it's an interesting tie-in. I think if you look at the one slide, Debbie, we're looking at the Danish system and you're seeing when you're ramping up load. Load actually can also provide storage, not in the sense of battery storage like Paul was talking about, but thermal inertia. You can preheat or pre-cool buildings. Thermal inertia, this building right here, this is a battery. We can use it as such, but we never think about it that way. And so again,